Well, hello there. Today we're discussing Elizabeth Johnson's very important and very influential book, She Who Is, The Mystery of God in Feminist Theological Discourse. Now, there's no doubt that the issues that Johnson is talking about in this book on feminine language for God have become more important since it was originally written in 1992. Just a week ago, the Anglican Church announced that it is setting a commission up to decide whether feminine language of God would be appropriate for the liturgy, and if there needs to be changes in the liturgical celebration every Sunday in order to bring a more inclusive and perhaps feminine language of God into the worship itself. For example, could we say, "Our Mother who art in heaven" in the Lord's Prayer? Could we address God as mother and daughter instead of father and son? All these issues are involved in Johnson's book, She Who Is. So today I'm going to give an overview of Johnson's argument and see the strength of what she's saying, and then I'm going to put her into dialogue with C.S. Lewis, a rather unlikely dialogue partner, who also has some claims about naming God as she, and through that discussion we'll see what the essential arguments are. Now, Johnson states the essential problem right at the beginning. She says we all know that God is above gender, but the problem is, in the Christian tradition, God has typically been associated with the male gender. And so, while God himself is beyond gender, God has typically been named in male kinds of terms. And this leads to Johnson's key claim that the symbol of God functions. What she's saying is that how we name God is absolutely important because it provides the way in which we think about God. The importance of the image can hardly be overstated. Far from being peripheral to human knowing, imaginative constructs mediate a world to us, she says. And the problem is that the symbol of God functions, and when the symbol becomes attached to one gender, even though we know conceptually that God is beyond gender, then the symbol becomes something of an idol, something that can be used as a tool of oppression. And she says the history of patriarchy makes it all too clear that this symbol of God has been used in oppressive ways against women, and ways that we need to correct. Dead metaphors make strong idols, she quotes Marcia Falk. And when the symbol of God becomes idolatrized into male kind of language and associated with one particular gender, then clearly that symbol is not doing what it's supposed to do. It's not a liberating, freeing invitation to relationship that God intends it to be when he named himself. So Johnson says we need to fix this problem in theological discourse. But how to do that? Well, there's certain ways that we could go about fixing this problem that are actually not very helpful, Johnson says. There have been some who've decided to address God impersonally. Karl Rahner, for example, calls God holy mystery. Paul Tillich calls God the ground of all existence. We could continue. There have been many attempts to address God in impersonal kind of language, partly to avoid the problems of associating a gender with him. But Johnson says that depersonalizes God, and God is a personal being. And so whenever we encounter persons in gender. And so we have to use gender language if we're going to really allow the symbol of God to be personal, which is the way God has related himself to us. There's another inadequate way of fixing this problem, and some people have tried focusing on feminine traits in God. It's clear that God is nurturing, for example. God is caring. And so maybe we need to just focus on those scriptural images of God, bring those out a little more, and that will fix our problem of gender and God. But Johnson thinks that doesn't go nearly far enough. After all, she says, the androcentric pattern still holds. All that we really get is a male God, characterized by all male categories, who now has milder characteristics, she says. He also has some of the feminine characteristics. Furthermore, Johnson says, this would simply cause us to stereotype. We would pick out traits associated with females, and we would say God has them, and we would pick out traits associated with males and say that God has them, and all of this would simply be a stereotyping of male and female characteristics. It sure looks like the patriarchal endocentric model still holds. Now, there's another way that we could go about trying to fix this problem that's also incorrect, Johnson thinks. We could try to identify the Holy Spirit as the feminine one in the Trinity. Some have tried that because the Hebrew word ruach is a feminine term, and that term spirit, breath, wind is a balancing perhaps of the father-son kind of language that we see in the other two persons. But Johnson thinks this would be completely ineffective as well. After all, the Holy Spirit is the third person, the kind of unknown one of the Trinity, the silent one, the one who is always blowing, always working, always doing things behind the scenes so that the Father and the Son are the ones who are glorified. They're the ones who get credit. And if we started emphasizing that in God, you could see how that image would work down toward the male-female relationship in a way that would be highly degrading to females. They would be the ones who would be expected to do all the behind-the-scenes work so that the males would get credit for it, and they would be the ones who would be glorified. So Johnson's proposed solution is very bold, but also very reasonable, we might say. We need, Johnson says, a strong dose of explicitly female imagery to break the unconscious sway that male Trinitarian imagery holds over the imaginations of even the most sophisticated thinkers. The symbol of God functions. The symbol of God has too long been held captive to maleness, and we need feminine imagery for God in order to break that spell. And so Johnson sets out to do just that. In the economic Trinity, she suggests that we might name Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as Mother, Mother Sophia, as Jesus Christ, Sophia's child, and as Spirit, Sophia. And then she develops how each of those would look in rather feminine terms. When we get to the immanent Trinity, who God is in himself, there would be also a variety of ways that we could describe this God in feminine kinds of imagery. We could describe the livingness of God as unoriginate mother, her beloved child, and the spirit of their mutual love. Very close to the psychological analogy of Thomas Aquinas. We could describe the vitality of this God as wisdom's abyss, kind of the fecundity of the Father, as the tradition has explained, the personal word of wisdom, and the energy of wisdom. Once again, something that Augustine or Aquinas would come very close to saying. From these names, then, Johnson develops several images that are more feminine and more useful for the full flourishing of women, she finds. We could emphasize more on mutual relation, more on community and diversity, more on radical equality. Mutual relation we could describe either through the social analogy, three women friends circling around together in the bonds of an unbreakable friendship. And we could think of God in those terms. Or we could think of mutual relation through the psychological analogy. A woman being herself, a woman expressing herself, and a woman befriending herself, all in an inclusive movement that issues in care for the world. These are categories that would be more helpful for women finding the full flourishing of their identity as females. We could also speak of the radical equality that must exist in the Trinity. And here Johnson is very aware. She sees a tendency of women to be poorly related to others. That is, so concentrated on the need of others or so dependent on their direction that this woman's own personal center is diffused. It's neglected. The woman is so outwardly focused that she neglects herself. And Johnson sees something of empowerment in the relations of the Trinity, that each of them constitutes the others in their being for the others. And so as they relate to each other, they find in themselves a self. And that self is absolutely centered as it's a center in relation toward the others. What a pattern, what a goal for women's relationships amongst each other. Or we could think of community in diversity. And here Johnson brings out the beautiful images of perichoretic relationships, something like a dance, a mutual encirclement, a caring for one another that is an absolute kind of caring. And she develops the rather creative analogy of a triple helix. We think of the double helix that contains the DNA code that is the source of all life, and she thinks of a third in that, a additional dimension to that code that would be the source and givingness of all things, the place where life occurs in all its creativeness and all of its beauty. All of these descriptions, I think we see, are incredibly helpful. They're incredibly close to what Christian tradition has always seen in the triune relationships in God. Well, much of what Johnson is saying is very helpful and very illuminating about the nature of God. The key question in this book, and what makes it perhaps controversial, is the question about whether it's appropriate to name God in feminine terms. And here I want to bring in C.S. Lewis to give us a different perspective because he shows, I think, what the most central issues in this discussion actually are. C.S. Lewis puts it this way in a little work called Women Priestesses, ? He's arguing that women should not be priests in the Anglican Church. He says this: suppose the reformer, this person trying to change and update the church, stops saying that a good woman may be like God and begins to say that God is like a good woman. Suppose he says that we might just as well pray to our Mother who art in heaven as to our Father. Suppose he suggests that the incarnation might just as well have taken a female as a male form, and the second person of the Trinity be called the daughter as well as the son. Suppose finally that the mystical marriage were reversed, that the church were the bridegroom and Christ was the bride. Now, Lewis says, it's surely the case that if all of these proposals were ever carried into effect, we should be embarked on a different religion. What Lewis is saying is that gender language comes from God and it means something. If we were to simply change the symbols, we would actually change the religion itself. Lewis continues, and I think it's worth listening to him in full. But Christians think that God himself has taught us how to speak of him. For Lewis, it's essential that God is the one who has given us the language by which we know him. To say that it doesn't matter is to say that either that all masculine imagery is not inspired, is merely human in origin, or else that, though inspired, it's quite arbitrary and unessential. And this is surely, Lewis says, intolerable. A child who has been taught to pray that to a mother in heaven would have a religious life radically different from a Christian child. The church claims to be the bearer of revelation. If this is true, then we should expect to find in the church an element which unbelievers call irrational, and which believers call super-rational. It's okay then that unbelievers don't understand this issue. There ought to be something in it opaque to our reason, though not contrary to it, and that is the real issue. With the church, we cannot shuffle and tamper so much. With the church, we are farther in. With the church, we are dealing with male and female not merely as facts of nature, but as the live and awful shadows of reality utterly beyond our control and largely beyond our direct knowledge. Or rather, we're not dealing with them, but they are dealing with us. So Lewis is saying there's something deep and very real about gender and about gender language that points to that gender. There's something so deep that as Christians we simply witness to that reality. Our language points toward that reality, and in a very real way, we don't understand it, but we still point toward it, of who God is actually like, and we must stick to those terms because God has given them himself. Here I think we can see that the real issue has to do with the givenness of language, or else the human construction of scriptural language. Now, at this point, Lewis and Johnson do very much disagree. For Johnson, scriptural language relates to an experience. It's something that we develop and that we have ordered because we are recognizing in ourselves a mystery deep within ourselves that we're pointing toward. Of course, scriptural language is normative for Johnson, but not so normative that it can't be added to or that we can't supplement it in very important ways, because that scriptural language really comes from our experience, and we're continuing to have experience of the Holy One, and so continual language needs to be added into Christian tradition. For Lewis, on the other hand, scriptural language is a given. God gives it to us, and we must hold to it, because even if we don't fully understand it, and we will never fully understand scriptural language about God, God has given it to us as gift, and therefore we must be responsible stewards of that language and hold to it. I think we can see then several different perspectives, and I would put them on a spectrum. At one end, we could see Lewis's argument that there is something inherently, indescribably male about God. Why do we know this? Because God has given it to us. Can we explain it? Absolutely not. But there is something that correlates with maleness in God. Naming of God must be in male categories and male terms, because God has given it to us to do it in that way. Now, on the completely other end of the spectrum is probably Johnson here, that God is above gender. We know that God is beyond gender, and so because our experience of God is always pointing toward this holy mystery who is God as personal being, we need to develop language that is female in order to ensure the full human flourishing of women alongside the full human flourishing of men. If all human beings are oriented toward God, then the language about God should be inclusive to include all human beings. Now, there is something of a middle ground here, and that is to recognize that God is beyond gender, but that God has given us language about himself, here agreeing with Lewis, in order to, in the patriarchal culture that the Bible is written in, best communicate to us. So we don't know what language God would give to us today in our world, but God gives to us in the world in which he came and talked with us and became one of us, language in male terms, because that best points toward who he is in salvation history. So, for example, we address God as Father because fathers are the ones who have property rights. They're the ones who own the inheritance and will give it to their sons. And we get adopted sonship in Jesus Christ, not adopted daughtership, because we're made full heirs with God. And the inheritance that God wishes to give us is completely ours. Or we say that we are the bride of Christ, and Christ is the groom, specifically because in that day, males reached out to females for marriage. That still today often is the case. The male initiates and the female responds, and so that language is most fitting to help us understand how we respond always to God. He's the one who initiates, and we're the ones who respond. In this position, then, we can recognize that God must be beyond gender, but in our human categories, that gendered language is appropriately male language, because in the world of the Bible, which we must continually put ourselves back into to understand God, that would be the fitting way for God to show who he is in relation to us. Of course, this discussion is ongoing. There are other options probably on this spectrum, and certainly it's too early to pick a winner in this debate, but all of these are important contributions to the dialogue that should be ongoing in today's world, and we'll pray that the Holy Spirit would guide the church into all truth, and that the way that we ought to talk about God will become more and more clear